Hello, and welcome to the Thoughtworks Technology Podcast. My name is Mike Mason, and I'm joined today by Tim Cochran, who is a tech director at Thoughtworks, and he's currently running our Scale Up studio. Hi, Tim.
Hi, Mike. Super excited to be here and talk about this topic.
Awesome. So the topic today is scaling Etsy. So Etsy, everybody knows them. They are a global destination for unique and creative goods. Their core challenge is that they have more than 100 million listings, and they need to connect 95 million buyers with 7.5 million sellers. They tripled their gross merchandise sales and their revenue from 2019 to 2021. So as you can imagine, that's quite a steep growth curve. And we're joined today by two folks. First of all, we have Keyur Govande, who is the Chief Architect and VP of Engineering at Etsy. Hello, Keyur.
Hey, Mike. How's it going?
Awesome. Thank you for being here today. And we have Mike Fisher. We're going to call him Fish to avoid the confusion with me. Mike Fisher is the former CTO of Etsy. Hi, Mike.
Hi, Mike. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. So scaling Etsy. So we had a little taste of some of the numbers in terms of the amount of products sold and the revenue growth, and I think we can all imagine that there's underlying infrastructure and technology growth to support that. But I think we'll start the story back in 2017. Fish, you joined Etsy as CTO in 2017. Can you tell us a bit about your approach to looking at scaling as you arrived in the organization?
Yeah, I think our scaling story, at least for me, definitely starts in 2017. When I first arrived, there was a couple of things going on. One, we anticipated we wanted to be able to really reignite growth. So that was in the minds of folks in that time. And there were definitely some areas that we felt were holding us back. One of which was that we were still in data centers. And as I think about this, I would call it tech debt in our data center architecture, in that we were in 3 data centers, but 2 primary and 1 backup. But the 2 primary really were required both to run. So we, that had just happened over time in adding services and, of course, doing things quickly, which is very normal in a company that's growing very rapidly like Etsy was. And suddenly one day you turn around and you're like, yeah, I've kind of got myself into something I've got to get out of. And so we certainly could have architected around that within data centers and redistributed services and stuff. But instead, we looked at things like the timeline for acquiring hardware. And one of the stories that I recall was we had a Hadoop cluster that was running at capacity. And so we put on order a new cluster. I think it was about 400 nodes. And that took, let's call it 4 to 6 months to get the approvals, order the hardware, get it in, establish it. And within 24 hours, the new Hadoop cluster was at 100% utilization. And so this, you could clearly see this was holding back the teams. The teams wanted to move quickly. And this process that we had and the timelines weren't really working for us. And so that's when we started thinking about, let's get to the cloud where we'd have, practically unlimited capacity and the ability to move as quickly as our teams wanted to, and quite frankly, could. Our teams could move incredibly fast. And so that was the thoughts around, initially, why we should start this migration to the cloud.
And so you worked with Keyur on that, and the two of you, as I understand it, kind of built this migration approach. Were you using any cloud services at the time, and how did you start that looking at that migration?
I actually think we were using a non-Google Cloud service as maybe storage at the time, so we had some experience. And yeah, I would say I'm glad Keyur's here because I can't express enough how much Keyur was instrumental in this migration. He's a very humble technologist, but he not only is a brilliant technologist and a super kind, caring, and mentor to tons of our engineers. But he also stepped up to lead this migration. So I'm really glad he's here to talk about this. And then I think even Keyur would agree. We're here representing literally hundreds of people's worth of work. That this was, just an enormous team effort. I think at one point we had about 25% of our engineering capacity working on the migration in some way. But Keyur was certainly instrumental in this. So I'm glad he's here to talk about it.
Thank you for those kind words, Fish. And yeah, could not agree more. In terms of how many people at Etsy played a part in executing this migration and have it be successful. I think for us, like Fish said, like we were using a non-Google cloud, but that our experience in the cloud was limited. We had existed in our data centers for the entirety of Etsy's like journey until that moment. So we had people who were cloud curious, but we really had not leveraged it in any meaningful way until we made that fateful decision in 2017.
And so, presumably there was some evaluation of cloud vendors. What kinds of things did you think about there?
One of the important things was partnership. And with any vendor, it's, you can spend a lot of time on contract negotiations, and we do. A lot of people do, and try to get all the terms and conditions down, and every single, try to think about all these, things that could happen. But at the end of the day, things come up that are outside that. And what really is going to matter is how they step up to help out and provide the service and care and all of that. That was, I would argue, at the very, very top of our list. And Google happened to be a vendor that really wanted to partner with us. They took the time to come in with actual engineers, not just sales reps, and learn about the way we worked, the things we cared about. One of which we can certainly talk more about is sustainability and how important that was to us, and how we thought about it slightly differently, but they were open to that, and really said, we will work with you to come up with ways that satisfy our concerns around that. So I think that's the two highlights. Pastor Keyur, he could probably talk more about some of the, we ended up with a decision matrix of hundreds, if not thousands of items, but Keyur could probably talk about some of the concerns that he had with vendors.
Sure. I mean, I think there is something to be said, like in terms of the GCP offering at being at that moment in time a much more cohesive set of services put together. So I think that was also on our mind in terms of, well, if we are like we were starting with nothing in the cloud, so like we had a clean slate, and in that and a more holistically designed like offering was more attractive to us. If we had had a ton of pre-existing cloud infrastructure, I think the decision matrix may have looked slightly different, but having nothing, like it was easy for us to just do an apples to apples amongst the various vendors and see, well, like which is the strongest package put together as a whole. And for us, like at Google won out.
I'm glad we've got Tim here as well, because Thoughtworks was another of our vendors and third party that was part of our journey. And the same thing I would argue that I just talked about with Google being just a great partner. Thoughtworks has also been along this journey with us from the very early days. I think Tim was probably joined maybe, 2 or 3 months after me, maybe not even that long, and was with us, him and the entire Thoughtworks team with us through this journey. And it's the same thing, like they shared a lot of our culture. They shared a strong engineering team. All of this really aligned. And certainly technical skills and competencies matter, but also that we feel comfortable that someone that shares our mission, purpose, values, things like that, really, really important. And Thoughtworks definitely hit the mark on that.
Awesome. Thanks for saying that, Fish. And just to come back to sustainability for a minute, like that's an interesting topic. I mean, today more than ever, but you folks were thinking about it back in 2017. Is that kind of, you were concerned about kind of cloud emissions kind of a thing? Like tell us a bit more about that. And it sounds like that also connects a little bit with Etsy's mission, as a company.
Yeah, it absolutely does. I mean, Keyur can talk even pre-2017 about how much the company cared and the efforts that went into sustainability, not only just for compute, but from the office space and actual commuting and things like this that the company really cared about. There's a pretty cool story about offsetting the shipping. This happens several years into my tenure at Etsy. And the company looked around and said, one of the things that creates, the most emissions is actually shipping our products from the sellers to the buyers. And how can we help offset that and do the right thing as a company? And we looked into it and said, it's going to cost, a little over a penny per shipment to do this, to buy carbon offsets. And we said, let's just do it. It makes sense. It's the right thing, even though, it's going to cost the company. It's just a pure cost. So we did it, and we ended up putting a little banner on the checkout page that said, Etsy's going to, pay the cost for offsetting this. And enough people saw the banner and cared about it to increase conversion enough to pay for that program. And that to me is just exactly the type of company that Etsy is, that they didn't go into it thinking, this is going to be, profitable for us. They went into it thinking this is the right thing to do for what we believe in. Turns out it happens to be great, not only for the planet, but for the business as well, which is just a huge win-win. And I think that's the type of mindset that we took into the cloud. One of the big concerns was not having visibility into the energy consumption for compute and storage and everything that we had in the data centers. We as data centers often bill by that, and so you have that exact data. And we were concerned about that being obfuscated in the clouds and so forth. And so we ended up, again, after the migration, a team took it upon themselves to come up with a concept called Cloud Joules, which is a measurement that tries to determine closely what type of energy we would be consuming, so that we can work both to reduce that and to offset that. And that's another case where we're really proud to partner with Google on that, because Google could provide some visibility and share that with other customers about the way we're thinking, which allowed us to have a much bigger impact than just Etsy. And the same thing I would say about Thoughtworks, exactly, that they also took this concept and they turned around and created that for not just GCP and Google's cloud, but other cloud providers. And they also, allow us to amplify our voice and our concerns. And yet again, just another example of the partnership that we saw both with Thoughtworks and Google on something that we cared really a lot about.
And I know, Tim, you've been somewhat involved with that. Can you tell briefly a little bit of the story of that?
I can a little bit. So Etsy were very generous, and they published a lot of how they were calculating the carbon footprint, and then essentially we have a sustainability program at Thoughtworks, and we were wanting to do the similar thing. So we collaborated and essentially used those algorithms and put that into kind of a node library for creating for calculating a carbon footprint, and it integrates with the cloud. It's since then we've, as Fish said, we've onboarded different clouds, and actually now it's part of a Backstage plugin. So anybody that's using Backstage can use the goodness that Etsy came up with. So yeah.
And I also think it's interesting to see that kind of stuff is now becoming a first-class part of most of the cloud vendors' dashboards as well, right? Like, so to me, that's actually, there's a direct line from that story to kind of having an industry influence, so that everybody's getting that. And just on the migration, just a little bit more. I know when we were talking about this, before the recording, we talked a little bit about the lift and shift versus kind of making something cloud native and then migrating it. Keyur, you were the brains of the operation, as I understand it. There, can you tell us a little bit about the trade-off between those two and the things that you learned?
Sure. So I think just to set context for everybody, so Etsy chose both paths. We lifted and shifted some things, and then we migrated other things in a cloud native manner. And the decisions were very much based on business requirements. So I think Fish, as he had mentioned earlier, alluded to the fact that we had a business need to make sure that our website could scale. So the user-facing side could scale up with the growth that we were hoping the business would generate. So that was critical, and we did not want to invest more in buying hardware in the data center to do that because we knew we were getting out. So that was our highest priority. So in that case, we prioritized speed, and we moved the Etsy web side of the house, as we call it, the PHP LAMP-based architecture in a lift and shift manner. One other reason for picking that was also the expertise on the team. The team felt a lot more comfortable with primitives that were similar in the cloud as they were in the data center. On the flip side, we moved our search engine and migrated it in a much more cloud native manner. That team was already well on the path towards Kubernetes, and Google came along and offered a fully managed Kubernetes offering in GKE. So we ended up prioritizing migrating to Kubernetes hosted first in the data center. Moving the LAMP stack up created spare capacity, so we were able to give them as much capacity as they needed in the DC to migrate to Kubernetes, and then we moved from a self-hosted to a managed offering in the cloud as a second step. The interesting trade-off there was we traded off a little bit of cloud learning in pulling this migration off, because the primitives that we were familiar with in the data center in Kubernetes were not always available to us in the cloud. The failure modes were different. Networking was not as reliable. So there was that learning curve for our search team and the SREs there. So that was also that's a thing that you need to keep in mind, where if you're wholesale re-architecting your application, then that is a risk that you take on. So you think about it and go with your eyes wide open.
What was interesting to me was sort of the way that Etsy approached the cloud migration, which I think to you is sort of just the logical way that you approach all your software problems, which was how do we do a test to make sure that it works, right? So it really felt that you were kind of applying kind of an evolutionary approach, and maybe you might even say sort of an MVP, kind of can we actually get the website running with the very basic. And then the other thing that I found was quite interesting was you gave a lot of control to individual teams to sort of decide how, the capabilities that they owned, how they actually wanted to progress them to the cloud, and what made sense based on what, the maturity of SaaS and cloud services were. So that was interesting, but I suspect that was probably just what just came out as logical to you guys, but yeah.
I do think the autonomy of teams is something that's just part of the Etsy culture. And it's important. It's continued. It's how all of the product teams and infra teams and enablement teams still run today, is trying to push that down to the lowest levels possible. They're the ones who have the right information, and they're the ones who can make that best decision. And then we do a lot of trying to share that knowledge. As Keyur was talking about, there's pros and cons to both approaches. And if one team learns something about either the network or managed service or something, trying to share that with other teams. When Keyur was talking about the migration for Etsy Web, the main marketplace, it reminded me of the story of that. He alluded to the fact that we didn't want to have to buy new hardware for that year. So, but because the hardware process to purchase, to put in the order, to get it made, to ship, rack, stack, implement everything was really months. and we have a very busy holiday season. That had to start no later than, I think it's the end of August, third week of August, something like that. And so the team, when they initially looked at this, and we signed the contract in December of 2017. So they looked at it and said, it'll take a year, but that means we're going to have to buy, at the time, it was like $5-6 million worth of hardware just for Etsy Web to run through the holiday season. And then they looked at it and they said, well, there's a chance we could do this faster. And the team really doubled down and said, if we could launch, migrate Etsy Web, the marketplace, by August, we could save all that money, not have to spend the hardware. And so that was the plan. That came to be the plan. We ended up, I think it was, we started, second week of August, something on a Sunday night, migrating, got everything migrated over, started taking internal transactions to test, and then ran into a problem and ultimately rolled back that evening. Great success, but not quite there. And then we shook it off. Tried to send people home after being up for 24 hours. They wouldn't even have it. They're like, we're solving this. They had it solved within hours. And so we said, okay, let's do it again. And that Tuesday night, and we're days away from just saying we're pulling the plug for the season and ordering the hardware, and we're going to stay in the data center through the holiday season. And we did it again that night, again, all night, migrating, got down to minutes again, with, of course, as these things go, finding errors and fixing stuff. And early that morning, in August, we started taking live transactions, and we're in the cloud, and we've been there ever since with the marketplace. And we avoided having to purchase the hardware, avoided all of that wastefulness, and the team just did an amazing job. But it's my point being that story is it's not a straight path. There was a lot of curves and bends to that, and the team is just such an amazingly strong engineering team that once they got it in their mind, they were just heads down and relentless on that, and did an amazing job.
Fish's story reminded me, which are unusual for tech companies. So we did take a maintenance window in order to execute the cutover. So the site was down for 4 hours on attempt 1 and 4 hours on attempt 2. So there's 8 hours of downtime. I think it was the right decision because it de-risked the effort a ton. Nobody was having bad experiences. We had put up a very nice looking banner saying, hey, we're doing something important. We'll be back. Trust us. And then the other thing that I just remembered was we ended up making some decisions along the way, because we were working with such a tight timeline that aligned with the skill set of our engineering team and what we could support operationally. Because I think we realized that we were cutting over to the cloud right before our busiest season, and we wanted our SREs to have all the information, everything that they needed in order to successfully execute, Black Friday, Cyber Monday, our peak days of the year, the things that we prepare for all year long. And this would be in a new environment. So I think that focus of, we need to do this, but we also need to do this in a way that things will work on game day, was a good sort of prompt for the team in terms of how to make decisions and what to prioritize.
So the move to cloud, you already had a strong engineering culture. And I think the culture story is an important part of this. And maybe it's worth digging into, briefly, what is the engineering culture at Etsy and how does that affect scaling? And also, how did the shift to cloud help or change what you're able to do with the engineering culture at the firm?
I can start. I do think Etsy's always, and I've known Etsy. So I joined in 2017. I actually met Etsy in 2008, right after they were founded and started, because they were already growing so quickly. They had some scale challenges. And so that's how I, as a consultant, got brought in. And almost from day one, they had this super strong engineering culture. And then with the leaders that came and went over the years, it just got stronger. And everything from Codis Craft, the blog, the speaker series, all the open source projects that the teams have done. Really just a super strong engineering culture. But the way I would describe it, the way I would talk to people about how I think about it was, our mission is to keep commerce human. And you see that every day on the marketplace, where Etsy connects one buyer with one seller at a time. And in our modern day mass commoditization, you don't always get that. And that is, just core of what we do. But if we only did that on the marketplace, I don't think we'd be fulfilling that mission. When you talk about keep commerce human, it also means how we've got to keep it human within the company as well. And I think engineering does this, just in other departments as well. But engineering, this is really how I witnessed people living and working, was treating each other as humans. That people are going to have good days, bad days. They're going to have skills. They're going to need development areas. Like, people are going to need help. I've witnessed so many times people drop everything to help someone else. And it's because we treat each other as humans. We care about each other. And that is the culture that I think just pervades all of Etsy engineering, is this human aspect of, which brings out all the wonderful things that you would expect of, like, caring, the blameless postmortems, that it's okay. People are gonna need development areas, like people are gonna need coaching and mentoring and all of that. I think that is what, it's great that we have like super strong technologists, and we do. But really, I think the superpower is that caring culture of treating each other humans, and really, really thinking about that.
I can tell a story that sort of impressed me, as someone working in your environment around that was. I think this maybe speaks a little bit to the learning and blameless postmortem as well. But we were learning at the time. I think we were all moving to Infra's code and Terraform, and one of the Thoughtworks had made a mistake in the Terraform, and pushed it to production, and it did actually cause not an outage, but it caused some degradation of the search. And what was kind of interesting about this is like the reaction, right? So first off, because at Etsy everybody helps each other, there was this immediate kind of like trying to help solve the problem, right? And the problem was solved in seconds, right? There was just an operational toggle that we could change, but then I think what was most interesting was like afterwards, as a consultant, normally when you kind of screw up a little bit, you get called into the headmaster's office the next day, right? But at this one, so it's like, I think someone leadership from the platform engineering team pinged me, and I was like, oh, here we go. And they actually asked me, is your consultant doing okay? And that was like a very surprising reaction from, and I think that speaks a little bit to the culture of Etsy, and the appreciating that everything's a learning opportunity, and and then the postmortem we discussed. Okay, well, how do we look for ultimately that Terraform didn't have any safety checks on it, and how do we improve the validation of that, and it became a useful conversation instead of a blameful conversation, right? And that was, I think, it's an interesting story. Yeah.
So I think you kind of mentioned some of the other stuff that you've been doing. There was something about product thinking as applied to infrastructure. So everybody talks about everything as a product these days, and I'm not sure everybody really gets it. And actually, it can mean a lot of different things in a lot of different contexts. Keyur, can you tell us a little bit about product thinking at Etsy in the technology department?
Sure. I think what you're getting at is what we internally call our enablement layer. And the reality is, like, Etsy is, like, for people who may not be aware, like, we're one large monolith, which is our PHP. It is deployed as a monolith and works as a monolith, and then we have a bunch of other supporting services. And what we found was that it not everything that we needed was available from our cloud vendors or as a managed offering that we could purchase. There were some things that were core to our business that we needed to build ourselves, and it and approaching those as products, as platforms that others that customers, when I say customers, I mean other XC engineers are going to use, was really, really important because we didn't want to build an Etsy, I think, and one of the ethos that has persisted over the years is like, we don't want to do technology for technology's sake. Like, we want to be solving business critical problems, problems that are hindering something. Like, it could be the engineer's happiness, their productivity, or even a business goal. And by bringing that thinking into how we prioritize and what we work on our internal platform teams is the clearest manifestation of what you were just saying, like product thinking. We have currently we have researchers, we have product managers who focus on our highest impact, highest ROI, like internal platforms, to make sure that like what we do for our customer facing, so end user facing, so Etsy.com and the apps, we apply the same rigor to the things that we build internally. And I think the last point I'll make is like through Fish's tenure, I think his perspective was like a very good like, what's the word, like checklist in terms of what should we be building internally. Like, we want I think the way that he would phrase it, and Fish, correct me if I'm wrong, was we don't want to build something that's a commodity. We would much rather pay somebody else to do it. We want to build the things that are additive to our business. So by using that rubric, like we don't have a ton of internal platforms, but the ones that we do have, we have strong conviction are like force multipliers for our business. So that helps, again, like not trying to do too many things at once, but the ones where we do, we have all the support that we need to make sure that they're successful.
And so one of the things that we sometimes see is that people make a good decision about building something, one day, because they've looked around and there isn't anything in the market, there is an open source tool. And so it is appropriate to kind of build something. But then, a couple of years go by and you're still maintaining that internal thing. People kind of have a little bit of an emotional attachment to it, some pride in the thing that they've built. And it's kind of, you almost, in some cases, some people don't end up retiring them at all. Like, was that something that you ran into and you needed to tackle?
So yes, that happens. But I think what helps is like periodically revisiting old decisions. I think to use something Fish says, like we try to avoid as many one-way doors as possible at Etsy. And every time like we make one of those one-way door decisions, like that has a ton of scrutiny. But most engineering decisions are two-way doors. And periodically, like either through a contract renewal or a sort of a re-architecture conversation, like we're happy to like open those up. And I won't list any names, but like I can say confidently that like over the years, like we have migrated a bunch of internal services that are now available as managed offerings, especially in the observability space. I think we've gotten a ton of value out of that for the company because we don't have to manage these large infrastructures that are necessary for a company of our scale. We would much rather somebody else do that for us, and we get the value out of building the alerts, the dashboards, the monitors that we need. So that is a way that like we have, by constantly reevaluating like some of these like old decisions, I think we've been able to not stagnate in that way.
Yeah, I completely agree that it's very normal. You make a decision one day, you get heads down on the next problem to solve. All businesses have challenges. There's constantly things going on that you're working on. And it's easy to let years slip by without reevaluating. And I think we've gotten pretty good at pausing and periodically reevaluating. Sometimes it's on a much more frequently 6 months, a year schedule. Sometimes it's multi-years. But we're always thinking about, I think about it and I call it moving up the stack And I mean that only in that you're getting closer to the customer, not that there's any more value, but we want our engineers as close to the customer's problems as possible so that we're solving directly what is most important for them. And in some cases, you may be the world's best at building the database, and that's really important to your customers if you happen to sell databases for a living. But if you don't, there's probably someone else that could do that for you and free you up and your engineering time up to go closer, like Keyur was saying, build on top of that database. And whether that's using someone else's logging and observability so that we can build the alerts on top of it, or someone else's other service so that we can then build features on top. We're constantly thinking about that of like, how do we get stuff that our customers really care less about and get towards the stuff they want more? Sometimes you can't. Sometimes there's not a vendor out there, and Etsy was certainly early enough that they had a lot of that, where they had to build stuff themselves. But I think we've been good at keeping an eye on that and saying, okay, that was the right decision. It is nothing, that was completely the right decision. And we're not saying that was the wrong decision, but times change. Technology moves very quickly. We see this, I think today, the biggest shift, most people would say is around machine learning and AI. That when, just a couple of years ago, we were standing up our own infrastructure because it wasn't there. Fast forward, now there's infrastructure within the clouds that is there. But we're building a lot of our own models. Fast forward today, like we can use some of these models, for computer vision and stuff that we just didn't even exist just a couple of years ago. So it was the right decision then, but now we're reevaluating that stuff. But it's moving so quickly, as everyone knows, that you've got to stay on top of it to try to make those timely decisions.
That's really interesting as well. Do you have a sense of, when you made those shifts, how much, effort, cognitive load it freed up on your teams, from managing a thing yourself to using a cloud service? Do you have a sense of that?
So I think Fish has a number for the overall cloud migration, which I think is pretty impressive. I'll let him speak to that. But the trade-offs are that, I think, just to call it out, when you do use a third party, you lose any internal visibility into the system. So you must be aware that now you're basically reduced to opening a ticket for this third party saying, hey, I need help, something is wrong. And I think in terms of the efficiency gained, I think that one is a little bit tougher to map because the work changes shape. So instead of managing infrastructure, for example, on the observability space, we've instead now, in Fish's parlance, moved up the stack. We moved closer to the product engineers who are leveraging these observability tools. So instead of being infrastructure SREs managing a ginormous cluster of logging machines, we're now a team of observability consultants who help our engineers make sure that their code is properly instrumented, has all the right tracing, all the metrics that they might need in order to troubleshoot and debug. So I wouldn't say that there was any efficiency gain from a people standpoint. It was just that the work changed. The work morphed into something that we thought was more valuable to us, which is this latter piece.
Yeah, in sort of large numbers, pre-migration, we were spending about 60% of our engineering effort on infrastructure and about 40% on product development. Post-migration, that number flipped. So that was great. So that was a good change. But if you then break down the infrastructure numbers, which is about 40%, it gets even better. What Keyur was saying is also within that, we actually only have 6% of our engineering effort on what we consider pure infrastructure. The other nearly 36%, 34% is focused on enablement, which is helping our product engineers. So the story is really, really compelling that if you just look at the big numbers, that's great. We shifted, a majority of our engineers towards product, great for our customers. But then if you even look at the infrastructure numbers, it gets even better. because they're now not managed as Keyur was saying, like these, really low level infrastructure pieces. They're working on stuff above that that's enabling our project engineers to move faster, quicker, have better experiences. So yeah, it's really about that story. I think that was the real primary purpose of migration, is to get the engineers as much up the stack, whether they're customers or other engineers or our buyers and sellers. And I think it's been a big success from that perspective.
And I think just to help our listeners kind of understand maybe a little bit of the punchline of the story, this was work that you began in 2017, migrating to the cloud, setting yourself up for scalability. And then none of us realized it was coming, but the pandemic hit. Can you tell us about that moment and what happened?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. Like, we started in 2017, knowing that we wanted to grow quickly, but not really having a sense of how fast we could grow. We were very fortuitous that we declared victory on our migration. Everything was migrated in February of 2022. 1 month later, March of 2022, COVID happened. We went into lockdown. We collectively sort of held our breath for a second. And quickly, the CDC gave guidance that cloth masks should be used if there's no alternatives, because all of the protective gear needed to be used for our healthcare workers and frontline workers. And so overnight, people turned to Etsy. And an interesting sort of story about what happened was, if you had gone to Etsy, say March 1st of 2022 and searched for face masks, you would have probably gotten either a deep cleansing, scrub or something for your face, or a Halloween mask.
Right.
You would not have gotten a protective piece of cloth that you could wear. And so there was two big issues with that. One was on the seller side. We might have had like 3 sellers at the time selling these protective masks, and the demand was way outpacing that. So we had to reach out to sellers, and you had the capability, had the skills to make masks, to say, all right, please stop making what you're making and pivot. We have a huge demand. And so that was a big effort to do that. We then, on the engineering side, had to retrain search. So by this point, we're using machine learning in our search algorithms. And we actually took a bunch, this is, having humans provide the training data. We took a bunch of humans and had them classify images that were of these masks and product listings, fed that in overnight to our machine learning models. And by the next day, the search results were where we wanted them to be towards protective mask. And then we had the issue eventually of overwhelming our sellers with orders. And so we had to work on engineering to be able to rotate sellers through there, bring them in and out of search, because they were getting, you could be in search, the top search results, and get 1,000 orders in a minute or a couple of minutes. It was happening that quickly. Back to so I think your initial question of like, that doubled our traffic overnight. And so having finished fortunately, the migration just a month before, we were able to scale, and our infrastructure and our teams didn't miss a beat. We didn't experience any downtime from that. Everything scaled, just as we had planned on it. And we didn't know it at the time, but it worked out really, really well for the company and for us. And sometimes it's better to be lucky than good, I guess.
Attentive listeners will notice that Fish misspoke and referred to 2022 when he actually meant 2020, the depths of the pandemic, for when Etsy's traffic took off. But he was in such a good flow that we didn't want to interrupt him and correct that. So it was 2020 when everything took off. Thanks. There is always a question about moving to cloud from an on-prem data center, and will you get the benefit and all that kind of stuff. And I think you've talked about the non-monetary benefits already in terms of the scaling, but that particular, happening, doubling your traffic, you just couldn't have done it on traditional infrastructure. You would have fallen over, right?
100%. We would have fallen over.
I think, if I may interject, like, there is another angle here that we didn't touch on that might be interesting to the listeners, which is the doubling. That the fact we were able to double in the cloud with I'll simplify and say like 2 lines of code. Like we changed the Terraform config to say this pool of machines goes from whatever X to 2X and hits apply, and we're up and running at 2X capacity. In the data center, like one of the things that would have been challenging, leaving aside all the procurement, would have been that level of API support to stitch everything together in order to provision a machine is lacking, right? Like Etsy for many years was on the path to inventing that internally when we were still on the data center journey. And I think that is a value addition of the cloud that I don't think like gets talked about enough, where it is all the APIs that are put together to manage your infrastructure is, I think, one of the key wins that that come from migrating to the cloud.
So in addition to, so we've basically been talking about technology and cloud, and I know that scaling Etsy was also about people, product, process, and we wrote about it in the article. But Fish, do you want to talk a little bit about the what we did around or what Etsy did around improving product delivery to help scale as well?
Yeah, absolutely. You're exactly right. When I think about scaling an engineering organization, I think about people, process, and technology. And you've got to constantly be thinking about each of those. I visualize them as dials that you're kind of turning, sometimes 2 at a time, sometimes 1 at a time, but you're always thinking about how do we need to improve in these? And it's a balance. If you scale up your technology too much, too quickly, it's a waste of money. As Keyur was saying, like if we had doubled our infrastructure before the demand was there, which we would have had to do with your ordering hardware, it's a waste of money. If you can do it just in time, then it's the perfect attribution of it. The same thing with process. If you put more process than you need at the time, you create bureaucracy. And nobody wants that. We want just the right amount of process for the maturity of the company, the size, the regulatory compliance, all that. So one of the things that we thought about was, how do we scale our process as we're growing the engineering team? And this is another example of how we partnered with a trusted vendor, in this case it was Thoughtworks, to help us with that. The team I mentioned, they shared so much of our culture. We actually had some former Thoughtworkers on our staff already, because the culture and the so much similarities around the strong engineering emphasis that they felt right at home. And when we brought Thoughtworks back in to help us with the migration, we also realized, this next phase is we need help with a process. And so we went through a period of examination of thinking about Agile. I'll say something a little controversial. I think I've said this publicly before, though. Agile is a failed methodology. And I say that because people treat it as if I just do a stand-up or a burn down or something, I'm Agile. And that's not what was intended, right? If we go back to the Agile Manifesto, it's a set of principles. And I think Thoughtworks agreed with us on the core of this is principle, that is what really makes a team agile, and that's important. And so we spent many months together working through this, and eventually what came out of that was what we called a product development culture. The famously saying, culture trumps strategy, culture also trumps process. And so instead of dictating that every team is going to do this flavor of agile or that flavor, we said, these are the principles. This is what you've got to work towards. And then we ended up giving them tools, a bunch of different tools that they could use. We said, this is really about the culture. These are what you've got to follow. And I think that was, along with it, just as important as the migration to the cloud in allowing us to scale up the engineering teams and deliver great product for our buyers and sellers. I think what we call the PDC was that important. We've actually just last year looked at it again and decided that we're calling it principles, getting really back to the core of Agile and call it product development principles. But it's the same concept that 5 years ago, something Thoughtworks helped us put in place that's been at the core of how we work every single day is around this culture and principles.
Okay, well, I think on that note, I will say thank you to our guests here, Tim, Mike, and Keyur. Thank you so much for being on the podcast today. Super interesting story about scaling at Etsy. There are a couple of articles that listeners can go look at for more info. They're on the martinfowler.com website, and we'll link to them in the show notes. If you're listening and you've enjoyed the podcast, please give us a thumbs up, a review, or a 5-star rating on whatever podcast app you're using to listen to this, because that really does help us broaden our reach and help people find the podcast. Again, thank you so much, Mike, Keyur, and Tim.
Thanks.
Thank you for having us.